It is funny how quick we are to slap a label on a teenager and call it a day. We point the finger, we shake our heads, and we say that kid is just out of control, as if rebellion happens in a vacuum. But let me tell you something I have learned from decades of sitting across from fractured families, looking them dead in the eye while they tear each other apart. There is no such thing as a problem child without a problem environment. When a family walks onto my stage and points universally at one person, usually the youngest, and tells me that this individual is the sole source of their misery, my internal alarms start ringing loud and clear. That is what we in the psychology profession call the identified patient. The family has collectively decided that if they just fix this one broken cog, the whole machine will run perfectly. But life does not work that way, and neither do families. I want to talk about a 19-year-old young woman who sat in the chair across from me not too long ago. Her family had basically written her off as a lost cause, painting her as this chaotic, malicious force of nature that was single-handedly destroying their home. They sent in a letter that was practically a novel, detailing every infraction, every screamed insult, every broken curfew, and every slammed door. They called her manipulative. They called her aggressive. They called her out of control. And to hear them tell it, they were just innocent bystanders, exhausted parents who had tried everything, loved her unconditionally, and were simply victimized by their own flesh and blood. But the girl I saw sitting across from me did not look like a monster. She looked like a cornered animal. She had that tough exterior, the heavy makeup, the crossed arms, the rehearsed eye rolls that teenagers use as a shield when they feel entirely unseen. When I first looked at her, I did not see a villain. I saw a kid who was drowning in a family dynamic so toxic that her only way of catching a breath was to scream. She had her own side of the story, a side she felt no one had ever bothered to listen to, and frankly, she was right. To understand what was really happening here, you have to look past the surface noise. You have to tune out the screaming and look at the foundation. The parents, let us call them Sarah and David, sat on my stage with an air of absolute self-righteousness. They had their narrative down pat. They finished each other's sentences, they nodded in unison, and they presented a united front of parental martyrdom. They told me how she would disappear for days, how she would curse them out, how she demanded money and respect without earning either. And yes, those behaviors are unacceptable. I am not in the business of excusing bad behavior, but behavior is a symptom, not the disease. You do not treat a fever by ignoring the infection causing it. So I turned to this 19-year-old girl and I asked her a simple question. I asked her what it was like to live in her house. And the tough, defiant facade she walked out with cracked just a fraction of an inch. She looked at me and her voice shook when she said that living in her house was like living on trial, where the verdict was always guilty before she even walked into the room. She described an environment of suffocating micromanagement, constant criticism, and impossible standards. She told me that no matter what she did, it was never enough. If she got a B, they wanted an A. If she cleaned her room, they found a speck of dust she missed. If she expressed an opinion, she was being disrespectful. This is what we call a rigged game. And let me tell you, when you put a human being in a rigged game where they know they cannot win, they will eventually stop trying to play by the rules. Why should they? If you are going to be punished and labeled a failure, whether you try your best or do your worst, human nature dictates that you are going to choose the path of least resistance. You are going to lean into the label they have assigned you. If they want to call her out of control, she is going to show them exactly what out of control looks like. It is a twisted kind of power in a situation where you feel entirely powerless. I watched the parents as she spoke. I watched their body language. They were not listening to her pain, they were listening to reload. They were waiting for her to stop talking so they could refute her claims, correct her timeline, and invalidate her feelings. That told me everything I needed to know about the communication loop in that house. It was not a dialogue, it was a courtroom. And Sarah and David were the judge, the jury, and the executioners. They had entirely lost the ability to hear their daughter's emotional frequency because they were so focused on her behavioral output. You have to ask yourself, what is the currency in this family? What is the payoff? People do not do things that do not generate a payoff. For the parents, the payoff of having an out-of-control daughter was that it absolved them of looking at their own failing marriage, their own anxieties, and their own shortcomings as parents. As long as they were united against the common enemy of their rebellious teenager, they did not have to deal with each other. The daughter was carrying the emotional weight of a deeply dysfunctional household, acting as the pressure valve for all the unspoken tension between her mother and father. And for the daughter, the payoff for acting out was attention. Even negative attention is better than feeling invisible. When she screamed, they looked at her. When she ran away, they looked for her. It was the only way she knew how to force them to engage with her on a level that felt real, even if it was destructive. She was screaming for validation, but she was doing it in a language her parents were completely unequipped to translate. They saw rebellion. She was demonstrating desperation. I had to break this cycle, and to do that, I had to strip away the rehearsed narratives. I had to get them off their talking points. I told Sarah and David straight up that if they came here looking for me to fix their broken child while they sat back and watched, they were in the wrong place. I do not fix people, and I certainly do not fix one part of a broken system and send it back into the same destructive environment. I told them that the 19-year-old girl sitting next to them was a mirror reflecting their own parenting back at them. And if they did not like what they saw, it was time to take a long, hard look at who was holding the mirror. That statement hung in the air like a lead balloon. You could see the defensive wall shooting up in real time. Sarah crossed her arms, her jaw set tight, while David physically leaned away, shaking his head. They wanted a referee to declare them the winners, but I was there to tell them that in this particular game, everyone was losing. They had spent 19 years building a dynamic based on control rather than connection, and now they were shocked that their daughter was rejecting the control. It was time to peel back the layers and figure out exactly when and where this family went off the rails. Because kids are not born out of control. They are molded by their experiences, by the way they are spoken to, and by the emotional safety they are provided. And somewhere along the line, this young woman had learned that the world was not safe and that her parents were her adversaries rather than her advocates. I sat there and looked at the history they had brought with them, a thick folder of grievances that spanned years. But you have to understand, a folder like that doesn't just appear overnight. It's built page by page, mistake by mistake, and silence by silence. I started digging into the backstory, the quiet years before the shouting started, because that's where the rot always begins. Sarah had grown up in a house where perfection wasn't an option. It was a requirement. She had carried that weight into her own motherhood, viewing her daughter not as a human being with her own agency, but as a project to be managed. She wanted a resume, not a relationship. David, on the other hand, was the classic ghost in the house. He worked 60 hours a week, coming home exhausted and emotionally unavailable. When the tension between his wife and daughter would boil over, he didn't intervene with wisdom or empathy. He intervened with a hammer. He wanted the noise to stop so he could have peace. And in his mind, the easiest way to get peace was to suppress the person making the most noise. They described this young woman as a happy child, a girl who loved to paint and dance, someone who excelled in school and looked up to her parents with wide-eyed adoration. But as she hit those pivotal early teen years, the shift began. It wasn't just hormonal, it was a response to the narrowing of her world. Every interest she had that didn't align with her mother's vision was mocked or marginalized. Every time she reached out to her father for a connection that wasn't based on an achievement, she was met with a blank stare or a lecture about the value of $1. By the time she was 15, she had figured out the fundamental truth of her household. She could never be good enough to earn their genuine approval, but she could definitely be bad enough to command their total attention. That is a dangerous realization for a child to make. She started with small acts of defiance. She'd wear clothes they didn't like or listen to music they found abrasive. And instead of ignoring the small stuff and focusing on the relationship, Sarah and David treated every minor infraction like a federal crime. They went to war over the length of a skirt and the color of her hair. They grounded her for weeks for things most parents would handle with a 5-minute conversation. And when you treat a small problem like a big problem, you effectively train the child to create even bigger problems just to keep up with the stakes you've set. The escalation followed a predictable, tragic trajectory. The more they squeezed, the more she pushed back. By 16, the out-of-control label was firmly attached. She started cutting school, not because she couldn't do the work, but because it was the one place her mother couldn't monitor her every move. She found a group of friends who were just as marginalized as she felt, kids who offered her the one thing she wasn't getting at home, acceptance without strings. Her parents reacted by trying to lock the doors, literally and figuratively. They took her phone, they put tracking software on her computer, they searched her room while she was at school. They created a police state in their own living room. If you treat someone like a criminal long enough, don't be surprised when they start acting like one. She felt like a prisoner, so she started acting like an insurgent. The verbal altercations became legendary. We're talking about 3-hour screaming matches that would end with the police being called because the neighbors thought someone was being killed. Sarah told me about the time her daughter threw a plate across the kitchen, shattering it against the wall. She used that as evidence of her daughter's mental instability. But when I asked what happened in the 2 hours leading up to that plate being thrown, the story changed. It turned out Sarah had been following her daughter from room to room, haranguing her, insulting her character, and refusing to let her walk away to cool down. The plate wasn't an act of aggression, it was an act of total emotional collapse. It was a person who had run out of words and run out of exits. By the time she turned 18, the dynamic had shifted from parenting to a full-scale Cold War. She was living in their house, but refused to speak to them for days at a time. She would come and go as she pleased, treat the kitchen like a 2-4-hour diner, and contribute nothing to the household. From David's perspective, she was a parasite. From her perspective, she was a squatter in enemy territory waiting for the right moment to make her escape. The tension was so thick, you could feel it through the screen in the pre-interview tapes. You saw the mother sitting on the edge of her seat, vibrating with a mix of anxiety and fury. You saw the father looking at the floor, his shoulders slumped, having checked out of the process long ago. And you saw the daughter looking everywhere but at them, her face a mask of cold indifference that hid a well of profound loneliness. The reason they finally called me was because of a specific incident that broke the camel's back. She had gone out on a Friday night and didn't come back until Monday morning. No phone calls, no texts, just total radio silence. Sarah had spent those 3 days in a state of near catatonic terror, convinced her daughter was dead in a ditch. When the girl finally strolled through the front door, looking tired but perfectly fine, she didn't offer an apology. She didn't offer an explanation. She just walked past her sobbing mother and went to bed. For David, that was the end of the road. He wanted her out, he wanted her arrested, he wanted her fixed, or he wanted her gone. But when I sat with them, I had to point out the glaring hole in their logic. They kept talking about fixing her as if she were a broken appliance they could drop off at a repair shop. I looked at David and said, "You're the father. You're the one who set the tone for this house. If she's out of control, who let go of the reins?" I looked at Sarah and asked, "When was the last time you looked at your daughter and saw a person instead of a disappointment?" You could hear a pin drop in that studio. They didn't have an answer because they hadn't asked themselves those questions in years. They had been too busy documenting her failures to notice their own. I began to peel back the layers of the out-of-control narrative. I wanted to see the side of the story she had been keeping bottled up. I asked her to tell me what she thought her parents wanted from her. She didn't hesitate. She said, "They want a robot. They want a version of me that doesn't exist, and they hate me because I can't give it to them." That is a heavy thing for a 19-year-old to carry, the belief that your very existence is a source of disappointment to the people who are supposed to love you most. She described the feeling of walking into her own home and feeling her blood pressure rise, the immediate defensive crouch she would go into the second she heard her mother's voice. She wasn't out of control in the sense that she was mindless. She was in a desperate, albeit misguided, fight for her own identity. We had to move into the escalation of the actual confrontation on stage, where the polite mask finally started to slip. I didn't want the rehearsed versions of their arguments. I wanted the raw, ugly truth of how they treated one another when the cameras weren't supposed to be watching. I challenged Sarah on her need for control, asking her what she was so afraid would happen if she just let her daughter breathe. I challenged David on his passivity, calling him out for being an absentee landlord in his own home. And I challenged the daughter to stop using her pain as an excuse to be a jerk, because while her parents may have lit the fire, she was the one kept pouring gasoline on it. The confrontation on that stage wasn't just about the words being said, it was about the energy in the room. You could feel the walls they had built over nearly 2 decades. I stood up from my chair and walked over to them, because sometimes you have to close the physical distance to close the emotional one. I looked at Sarah, who was sitting there with her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. I asked her a very pointed question. "What is it that you are so afraid of?" She looked at me, confused, and started listing off the daughter's behaviors again, the staying out late, the drugs she suspected, the company she kept. I stopped her right there. I said, "No, Sarah, I'm not asking about her list of infractions. I'm asking about your heart. What is the terror that keeps you awake at 3 a.m.? And that was the first time we saw a crack in the armor. Her eyes welled up, and she admitted that she was terrified her daughter would end up like her own sister, someone who had struggled with addiction and eventually disappeared from the family altogether. Sarah wasn't parenting the girl in front of her. She was parenting a ghost from her past. She was so consumed by the fear of a repeat performance that she had turned into a warden. She thought that if she could just control every variable, she could prevent the tragedy she had seen before. But I had to tell her the hard truth. You cannot control someone into loving you, and you certainly cannot control someone into being healthy. All she was doing was creating the very rebellion she was trying to prevent. I told her, "You are so busy trying to save her from a life she hasn't even chosen yet that you are losing the daughter you actually have right now." Then I turned to David. David had been sitting there like a statue, nodding along when his wife spoke, but remaining largely invisible. I told him, "David, you're a big man. You've got a big voice when you want to use it. But in this house, you're a ghost. You've abdicated your role as a father and a husband because it's easier to go to work and hide than it is to come home and deal with the chaos. He tried to defend himself, saying he worked hard to provide for them, but I wasn't buying it. Providing a paycheck is the easy part. Providing emotional leadership is where the real work happens. I told him that by staying silent while his wife and daughter tore each other apart, he wasn't being a peacekeeper, he was being a coward. His silence was a form of rejection. Every time he walked away from an argument, he was telling his daughter that she wasn't worth the effort of a resolution. Then I turned back to the daughter. She was smirking, clearly enjoying seeing her parents under the microscope. I had to shut that down immediately. I looked at her and said, "You think this is funny? You think winning an argument on national television is going to fix your life? Because let me tell you something, kid. You are 19 years old. You are legally an adult. You can talk all you want about how they messed you up, and you might even be right about a lot of it. But at some point, the victim card expires. If you stay in this cycle of reacting and lashing out, you aren't being an independent woman. You're being a puppet. They pull a string and you dance. They yell and you scream. You are letting them define who you are just as much as they are trying to define you. I wanted her to see that her rebellion was just another form of dependency. She was so focused on being the anti-daughter that she wasn't actually becoming herself. She was just the opposite of whatever her mother wanted. I asked her what she wanted her life to look like in 5 years. She didn't have an answer. She had spent so much energy fighting against them that she had never spent a single second thinking about what she was fighting for. That's the tragedy of these out-of-control kids. They aren't going anywhere. They're just spinning their wheels in the mud, making a lot of noise and throwing a lot of dirt, but staying exactly where they are. The breakthrough didn't come with a giant apology or a group hug. It came when I forced them to acknowledge the secondary gain of their behavior. I asked them to look at the payoff. Sarah got to be the martyr. David got to be the victim of a chaotic household. The daughter got to be the rebel who didn't have to take responsibility for her own failures because she could always blame her crazy parents. They were all getting something out of this misery. It was a comfortable, familiar hell, and they had become experts at living in it. I told them, we are going to stop the blame game right now. From this second forward, we are not going to talk about what happened 5 years ago or even 5 days ago. We are going to talk about what happens 5 minutes from now. I introduced the concept of a negotiated peace. I told the parents they had to stop the surveillance and the constant criticism. I told them they had to treat their 19-year-old daughter like a tenant rather than a toddler. If she lives in your house, she follows the house rules, but you don't get to manage her internal life. And I told the daughter that if she wanted the rights of an adult, she had to accept the responsibilities of an adult. No more screaming, no more disappearing without a word, and no more expecting a free ride while she treated the people providing it like enemies. I could see the gears turning. For the first time, they weren't looking at me as a judge, but as a navigator. They realized the ship was sinking, and they were all on it together. The daughter's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine uncertainty. That uncertainty is where the healing starts. When you finally admit that your way isn't working, you open the door to a new way. I told them I was going to provide them with the resources to continue this work off camera with professionals who could help them dismantle the toxic patterns they had spent years perfecting. But I also gave them a warning. I told them that the hardest part wasn't going to be on my stage, it was going to be on the car ride home. It was going to be the next time someone forgot to do the dishes or someone came home 10 minutes late. The old patterns are like a well-worn path in the woods. It's easy to fall back into them because you don't have to think. You have to be conscious. You have to be deliberate. You have to decide that you would rather be happy than be right. I watched as the daughter finally reached out and took her mother's hand. It wasn't a perfect gesture. It was awkward and tentative, but it was the first time they had touched in a way that wasn't aggressive in years. Sarah didn't squeeze back immediately. She was too stunned. But then she did, and she started to cry. Not the angry, hysterical crying we had seen earlier, but a quiet, exhausted kind of weeping. It was the sound of a mother who was finally letting go of a burden she was never meant to carry alone. We sat in that silence for a moment. I let it breathe. You have to let those moments sink in because they are the foundation for everything that comes next. I looked at David and saw that he was finally looking at his wife and daughter, really looking at them instead of at the floor. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a very long, very bad dream. I told him, David, this is your family. They don't need your paycheck as much as they need your presence. Don't go back to sleep. The walk from the stage to the backstage area is often where the real work begins. When the lights go down and the audience starts to file out, the adrenaline that keeps people guarded starts to dissipate. That is when you see the true weight of the situation settle onto their shoulders. I walked with this family back to the dressing room area, and I could see that the out-of-control daughter wasn't the same girl who had walked out an hour earlier. The defiance had been replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. When you spend every waking hour of your life in a defensive crouch fighting an invisible war against the people you live with, it takes a toll on your soul. I sat them down one last time before they left the studio. I told them that what happened on that stage was just a beginning, a crack in the dam. But the flood of change doesn't happen just because you had a breakthrough on television. I looked at the daughter, let's call her Chloe, and I told her, you've spent the last 3 years of your life defining yourself by what you are not. You are not your mother's puppet. You are not a good girl by their standards. You are not a straight A student, but you haven't spent a single second figure out who you are. I told her that being an adult isn't about the right to stay out late or the right to ignore your parents' phone calls. Being an adult is about taking ownership of your own outcomes. The problem with being labeled out of control is that it becomes a convenient excuse. If you are out of control, then you aren't responsible for the wreckage you leave behind. You can blame your impulses, your anger, or your parents' nagging. But I looked Chloe in the eye and told her that the day she turned 18, the out-of-control excuse expired. From that day on, every choice she made, every slammed door, every missed day of work, every lie was a deliberate act. And if she wanted her parents to stop treating her like a child, she had to stop giving them evidence that she still was one. You can't demand the keys to the kingdom while you're still throwing tantrums in the sandbox. I turned to Sarah and David, and I didn't let them off easy either. I told them that they had to go through a period of monitored withdrawal. They were addicted to the chaos just as much as Chloe was. They were addicted to the drama of the rescue, the self-righteousness of the grievance, and the illusion of control. I told Sarah specifically that she had to stop being a helicopter parent and start being a lighthouse parent. A helicopter hovers, creates a lot of noise and wind, and tries to force the person below to move in a certain direction. A lighthouse just stands there stable and bright, showing the way and marking the hazards, but it doesn't chase the ships. If the ship hits the rocks, the lighthouse doesn't move. The ship has to navigate. The transition back to reality is never a straight line. I checked in with them about 6 weeks after the show. It wasn't all sunshine and roses. They had a massive blowout on the third night back. Why? Because Chloe didn't do the dishes, and Sarah turned it into a referendum on Chloe's entire character. David, true to form, tried to hide in the garage. They fell right back into the old groove because the groove was deep and familiar. But here was the difference. Chloe didn't stay out all night this time. She walked out of the kitchen, went to her room, waited 20 minutes until she was calm, and then came back out and said, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't do the dishes, but I'm not going to let you talk to me like I'm a criminal. I'll do them now, but we need to talk later." That is what progress looks like. It isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of a better way to handle it. Chloe was starting to claim her side of the story, not by shouting it, but by living it. She started to realize that her out-of-control behavior was actually giving her parents more control over her than ever. When she acted out, she was essentially handing them the remote control to her life and saying, "Here, press the angry button." By staying calm and setting boundaries, she was taking the remote back. We worked with them on a written family covenant. No more vague expectations or unstated rules that change depending on Sarah's mood or Chloe's attitude. We laid it out in black and white. If Chloe lived in the house, she contributed to the house. She had to have a job or be in school. She had to keep her common areas clean. In exchange, Sarah and David had to respect her privacy. No more searching the room, no more tracking the phone, no more unsolicited advice about her hair, her friends, or her clothes. If they wanted her to be an adult, they had to give her the space to fail as an adult. I told David that he had to be the enforcer of the boundaries, not the avoider of the conflict. He had to step up and tell Sarah when she was overstepping, and he had to tell Chloe when she was being disrespectful. He couldn't just be the guy who paid the mortgage. He had to be the guy who maintained the emotional integrity of the home. It was a tall order for a man who had spent years practicing the art of being invisible, but he started to see that his silence was actually a form of permission for the chaos to continue. One of the most profound things Chloe said to me during our follow-up was that she had spent years feeling like she was a guest in a home where she wasn't particularly liked. That is a heartbreaking insight. When a child feels like they are a burden or a disappointment, they will eventually stop trying to belong and start trying to destroy. We had to work on rebuilding the emotional bank account of that family. For every withdrawal, every argument, every criticism, they had to make 5 deposits of appreciation, kindness, or neutral connection. They had to learn how to be in the same room without talking about the problems. They had to learn how to just be a family again. I remember talking to Chloe about the labels we carry. I told her that people will always try to label you because it makes them feel safe. It's easier to call someone crazy or out of control than it is to look at the complexity of their pain. But I told her, the label only sticks if you provide the glue. If she stopped acting out of control, the label would eventually fall off because it wouldn't fit anymore. It was up to her to change the narrative. She had to prove them wrong, not by arguing, but by outgrowing the version of her they had in their heads. There were moments where it looked like they might fail. Sarah struggled immensely with the letting go part. She would see Chloe on her phone and immediately assume she was talking to those people or doing something she shouldn't. She had to learn to sit with her own anxiety without projecting it onto her daughter. We had to get her into her own therapy to deal with the trauma of her sister's addiction, because that was the lens through which she saw everything Chloe did. Once she started healing her own past, she stopped trying to fix it through her daughter's present.